Good morning. Welcome to Sam's How To. This video is a part of a series where I explain every setting in VRay. I'm going to start today by explaining the common tab in the VRay settings and also the frame buffer options, global switches, and image samplers. So let's get straight to it. Okay, so in this series, guys, I'm going to be explaining all the settings in VRay. I'm going to start by explaining a few of them in this video, as I told you, and then there will be more videos to come. Now, if you want to keep following, subscribe down below and hit the bell icon to keep being notified for the new videos. So this scene I've downloaded from the Chaos group for VRay themselves. I'll leave the link below. I've only changed this phase in here to make it glass so we can explain a few things when we go to the settings. Now, of course, you can go to the VRay settings by pressing F10 on your keyboard or by clicking on this button right here. Now in here, the VRay settings, it looks like this. If you don't have this already, you just need to assign VRay as your main renderer from here, and then from then you can get these options in here. Now the first thing you're going to see is the common tab in here, which has the common options. There's not many things you need to change in here, but let's start explaining one by one. Now the first thing in here, the time output. Now this can be used when you're creating maybe a single shot, or if you're using this to create an animation. Now for a single shot, as you can see here, self-explanatory, single in here is taking one single shot, one render for your scene, usually for interiors and so. The second one here is active time segment. You can choose this one to render between these frames. If you can see here, this is the timeline that I have. It has 100 frames. You can increase that, of course, if you want it, but right now what I have is 100. If you press on this one, the active time segment will be from 0 to 100. Now this will take the whole timeline. Now, but if you only want a range of the segments or a range of the frames, you can go to range in here and choose what you want. Like for example, if you want to just render between the frame number 30 and the frame number 100, you'll do so, or of course you can change this number as much as you want. And the last thing in here is by frame. Now by choosing this one, if you need to just render a specific range of frames, like for example, the default here will render frame number 1, frame number 3, and between frame number 5 and 12. You can choose whatever range that you like and you can go ahead and do it. Now let's just leave this to single for now. Second thing here is the area to render. Now this, by choosing this one, you will get a few options in here, so you can choose where or what exactly to be rendered. The view is pretty obvious, which is what you have in here, the view of your camera, or just the view without the camera if you want it, but of course you will eventually need a camera to render the final render that you want. Now in here there are a few more options: selected, region, crop, blow up. You can choose whatever you want from them, whatever suits you, but usually you will only keep it to this view, and you can just adjust your camera to what you want and then render it. Now the next one is the output size. Now this will be the size of the image and also the size of the frame buffer. We're going to speak about the frame buffer in details in the next tab, but for now you will need to choose this. This will be the resolution on the frame buffer. Now there are a few presets in here. You can also choose presets from this drop down. For example, choose HD TV, and then you can choose one of these. And if you want something like custom, if you want to have something in 4K or so, you can just do so from here. You can enter any manual resolution that you want in these sections, and that will be it. Now the next tab here is the VRay. VRay tab has a lot of useful settings. We're not going to talk about all of them this time. We're only going to talk about the frame buffer, global switches, IPR options, image sampler, which is this one, and then also these are connected, the image sampler and the bucket or progressive. We're gonna talk about this in details. So the first thing is the frame buffer. The frame buffer is a very powerful tool. It helps you edit, save, view, and check your render. Now you can see the last visual of the frame buffer from here, or you can also press on this icon right here to last. This will show you the frame buffer. Now the frame buffer has so many options all over the place. We're gonna explain these in details later in other videos, but right now what you need to know is these options in here in the settings. The first thing you need to do is enable the built-in frame buffer. This is very important, otherwise you'll be using the frame buffer that comes with the Macs that does not have the same options or the same versatility. Now, of course, second thing is the memory frame buffer. You need to keep this selected to save your renders in the memory. Now the next thing here is this option here to get resolution from Max. Now if that's what you want, you need to select this one and it will get whatever resolution the Max had before you start the VRay. But I would recommend that you uncheck this one and input whatever resolution that you want. You can see here, of course, the width, the height, and you can swap them if you want. There are a few presets in here, and also you can control the aspect ratio and you can lock it just in case you wanted to change this and you want it to stay the same, or you can keep it like this if you want to have anything that is custom made, maybe a square or something like that. And also the pixel aspect, which in case you wanted pixels that are not square, you can change that from here, but I would leave it at 1 at all time. Now the next one in here is VRay raw image file. Now this is very useful if you want to save your render as raw, so you can edit it later in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever. Treat it as just any raw image that comes from a DSLR or any professional camera. You can select this one, you can choose here and select the folder that you want to save this to, and also this generate preview is very helpful. In case you did not select the memory frame buffer, it will generate a preview that will not use as much RAM as this one. In case you didn't have enough RAM to run the render, it's very useful. Keep this unchecked. Alright, the next one is separate render channels. Now you can select this if you wanted to save the RGB or the alpha channels separately. You can do this by selecting this option, and as you can see, the RGB, the alpha, anything, if you have any masks, if you have any channels saved, we're gonna talk about that later, of course, but if you have them already, so you can go in here, separate the render channels, and it will save them separately. And of course also you can save them in separate folders. They will have, each folder will have the name of the channel on it in your render file. And also this one here, expand the hashtag symbol to frame number, which means that if you choose the hashtag in the name, it will replace it with the frame number. This can be used if you're rendering many frames for an animation or something like that. It will replace the hashtag with the number of the frame itself, so you can keep track of what you're rendering and which channel it is and where does it belong to. Now the next one, the global switches. This is a very useful tool. Global switches control almost everything in your scene without having to actually change it. Like for example, you can turn off all the lights just by hitting the switch. Whatever lights that you have in the scene, except the hidden lights, will be switched off. Now, hidden lights are controlled from here if you want to render them or not, if you hide any lights for any reasons. Now, also, as you can see here, there is the displacement, if you want to render displacement or not. Like for example, if you have these grooves in the wood created by displacement map, if you want to just test render it without having the displacement rendered, you can uncheck this box. Now, we talked about lights, hidden lights, shadows. You can turn the shadows off. Also here, default lights. Default lights are the lights that Max put in the scene by default, and you can choose what happens to them in here. You can turn them off completely, you can turn them on, you can turn them off only when GI global illumination is selected, which is the default and which is what you should leave it to unless you're trying something else. Now also you can choose the adaptive lights and the light tree and all this. Lots of options for lights to choose from and to control. Do not render final image. This can be used sometimes when you're rendering animations. You can choose this one just to collect the lights and the rays and the reflections and everything without rendering the final image, which you will save and then reuse for the final image. We're going to talk about that when we're talking about animation, but anyways, it's very useful. Now, more things in here. Reflection, refraction, override depth. This can be used if you have, for example, if you have maybe a glass material and you don't want to render a lot of depth to it, a lot of transparency, you can just override this and put a certain depth that VRay will not go past. Now in here, this is a very nice option, override material. Now override material is an option where you can apply one material to the whole scene, so you can just check how the lighting would look, how the shadows are, how good or bad your materials are lit or your scene. You can choose this one. I would select this, select the VRay material, and then open the material editor, drag this and drop it in one of your materials. Make sure you choose instance, and when you do so, you will get the control over the material in here, which will override everything in your scene. Now press on it. I would choose something a little bit lighter around here, press OK, and then if you render this one, if you render your scene, you will get something like this. Everything in the scene has this material applied to it, and this will help you find out if you have anything wrong with the lights, with the shadows. You can check your lighting, you can check your materials, see if they are well lit, if there's any dark areas that you want to work on. It's a very helpful tool. Now let's deselect this one and go to glossy effects. Now this can be demonstrated if you have a glass material like the one that we have in here. You can choose for it to have a glossy effect or not. You can choose the reflection or refraction from here. We can check this in here. Now this image in here was rendered without the reflection and refraction. If you can see here, there is no reflection at all. This is glass without reflection and refraction. It just looks like a black blob. So now in here, this one was rendered without the glossy effects but with the reflection and refraction, and then this one, the final one, is rendered with the glossiness. Now let's compare these together in here. Now if you can see the difference, Now this one is without glossiness. As you can see, no reflections in here, no reflections in here. And if you move this one, you can obviously see the difference. Alright, very useful when you're trying to render, to just understand what's happening in your scene. Now, the next option in here would be the maximum transparency levels. You can set the transparency level to a certain depth if you want it, where if VRay finds out that it's more than this one, it will stop. Transparency cutoff also can be changed from here. Okay, a very useful option as well in here is the IPR options. The IPR is the interactive production rendering. The IPR is where you can get a live image of your render and have a live feed, let's say, about what you're having. Now, to enable this one, you will need to press start in here or press this button right here. And for the sake of making this fast, we're just gonna render this area. Let's actually make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, that's it. And hit start. Now this will start rendering this specific area, and it will keep track of whatever changes you make to the scene. Let's just fast forward through this. Now, as you can see, the image is kind of rendering, and this is a live view. If, let's say, we go in here to the material editor and we change the color of this glass to, let's say, something bluish, instantly the live preview will show you what's going to happen, and you can keep changing this or changing anything in your scene to get the effect that you want, and IPR will show you exactly what's happening with or while you're changing this. Now it has two options, as you can see: fit resolution to frame buffer, which will make the resolution here interactive with the frame buffer. If you choose to enlarge the frame buffer, the resolution here will change, and therefore it will start rendering again with the new resolution. And if you make it smaller, it will do the same, and so on. Second option here is force progressive sampling. Now, progressive sampling is the one right here in the image sampler. I will talk about this in a bit. There are two options in here, the bucket and progressive. If you chose bucket in here and you chose here to force progressive sampling, when you start the IPR, it will only start in the progressive sampling, and it will use this progressive sampling. It will not use the bucket that you've chosen in here. If you don't want that, you can just uncheck this option. Alright, so the next one, very important, the image sampler. So image sampling is how VRay deals with anti-aliasing, and anti-aliasing or image sampling is the algorithm that VRay uses when there is more than one color that exists in one pixel. Now, since the pixel can only carry one color, there should be something to be done to understand the colors around it and to try and sample and overcome this. Now, if you can see here, this image right here, it shows how one pixel, this tiny little square in there, can have or should have more than one color on it. The color of the fruit, the color from the spoon, and this may be the color of the reflection of the fruit on the spoon or the background. Now, one pixel cannot have more than one color, and therefore this is why VRay samples everything around the pixel to come up with a solution for this. Alright, now as you can see for this image as well, all these images, by the way, are on the Chaos Group website. I'll leave the links below in the description. There's a lot of useful information in there. You can go and check it. Now this image here perfectly demonstrates the anti-aliasing. As you can see here in this image, if you look here at this curve, you can see these jagged edges, and this is what happens with lower image sampling subdivisions. Now when you increase the subdivisions, this is a comparison between one subdivision and 24 subdivisions. Now you can see here with 24 the edges are a lot smoother, and see if we press like here and here in this example at the top, if you can check the difference about how smooth this one is and how rough and jagged this one is. Now this is how image sampling works right here. For example, if you have this circle in your scene, this is how the samples will go. Now as you can see, VRay will take one sample in each pixel. If this sample is solid, if this sample has only one color, it will go through and nothing will happen. Like this example right here, the sample came out that this whole pixel has only one color, so in different passes nothing will happen, just one sample. But in this pixel right here, it came up that this pixel has two colors in it, right? So it will create other phases depending on the option that you choose. More phases you choose, the more samples that will be taken and the more accurate this curve will be. Now this is pass 2 and this is path 3. It will define the edge perfectly with more samples. So let's go back to the Max and check the settings for this. Now as you can see here, image sampler, our anti-aliasing, it has two ways. Now the first one is the bucket, the second one is progressive. Now there is no right or wrong here. There is no specific right image sampler and wrong one for a specific type of photo. It comes with practice, of course, and preference. But there are things you need to know. Now for the bucket image sampling, this does not use a lot of memory. It will divide your picture to little squares called buckets, and it will render and sample each square on its own. Alright, while the progressive one will take samples for the whole picture and then keep going in different passes, and the more passes there are, the more accurate the anti-aliasing will be and the less jagged and fuzzy your picture will be. So for the first one, for the bucket, which is very good by the way for the distributed rendering, because the progressive one is hard to handle and it will send and receive a lot of data through Wi-Fi or whatever connection that you have, which will not utilize the CPU as good as possible. But the bucket, since you can control it and since it's a small bucket distributed to a certain device, it's a lot safer and better when you're using distributed rendering. And also if you're doing a test render or anything like this, it will be a lot better. Now for the bucket, the options here are as follows. The render mask is if you want to mask a specific area, if you want to have only a texture that is not black to be rendered, well, the black doesn't. If you want only a selected object to be rendered, include and exclude is the same, but you can include multiple objects to be rendered. Layers, if you have many layers in your scene and you want to render only one layer, you can choose this one, or also you can render by object ID. Now the specific options for the bucket will be in here, like If you choose also the progressive, it will be in here on bucket. It's not right here, but in here you'll find the minimum shading rate. Defines how many rays will VRay use for the anti-aliasing compared to what he's going to use for the shadows, for the lines, for the GI. So higher number of this will give you more fuzzy because it will have less room for anti-aliasing, and lower number will give you better anti-aliasing and better image sampling. Now, to go to the settings for the bucket in here, the minimum subdivs is 1. Usually you leave it at this one unless you have maybe an animation or maybe you have something that is very, very thin. Other than that, you will leave this to 1. Now the maximum subdivs is where you can control the maximum number of samples inside a pixel. Now when you put 4 or 1, any numbers in here are squared. So for example, if you have 4 in here, that means that you have 16 samples and so on. Now please note that this is the maximum number, and VRay might take less than this if it finds out there is not a lot of difference between the object and what's around it. Now the noise threshold, of course, is the threshold of the noise that you want in your scene. Of course, if you want it to be completely sharp, you want to set this to 0, which will mean that VRay will keep sampling until it's completely sharp and there are no differences in samples, and this should be left. If you're doing a test render, it could be something around 0.01, and if you're doing the final render, it can go to 0.005 or something like this, or 0.02, whatever you like. Now in here, the bucket width and height, the lock button here is if you want to control, if you want this not to be square, but if you want it to be square, you can control how big or small the squares are, the buckets for the sampling. Now the bigger the bucket is, the more memory that will be consumed, because there's a lot of data that will be saved in your RAM while rendering. So smaller bucket means less memory, less RAM to be used while rendering, and bigger ones mean more RAM. Now for the progressive one, same settings are in here, and these are the settings for the progressive image sampler. As you can see, the same thing, minimum and maximum. As usual, the minimum should not be more than 1. It doesn't have to unless you're rendering something that is very delicate or you're doing an animation. Now the maximum is also the same. The maximum subdivs means the maximum samples that VRay will take, and this is, as we said, it's squared, so 10 would mean 100 samples. Now here, the render time, in here you can set a time limit for your render. For example, if you choose 1 minute or 2 minutes, this is the maximum time your rendering is gonna take to collect the GI and everything included, and then it will start rendering. Now as I told you, noise threshold should be low as possible. As you can see here, I set it to 0.005, and this is what you should choose for your final image. The ray bundle size is for when you're using distributed rendering. You can choose the size of the bundle that you will send and receive, so you can control how much data will be coming and going over your connection, and therefore you can also control how to utilize the CPUs on other devices that you're using. Now that was it for today. Now if you have any questions, or if you would like to see something specific in the next episode, please leave a comment below, and to receive notifications and follow up with next videos, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Thanks a lot. Peace.